Hello, this is the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Today we're looking at experimental probability. Now, experimental probability is a little different from the probability that we've been looking at. So, we've been looking at theoretical probability. So that's what should happen, what would happen in theory. So when I say, for instance, that the probability when you toss a coin of getting a heads is a half, I'm talking about the theoretical probability. Half, of course, is a number between 0 and 1. It's a proportion. So when I say the probability of getting heads is a half, what I'm saying is that if you toss a coin many times, you should expect to get half of them heads and half of them tails. But of course, that won't always happen. Experimental probability is what actually happens. So if I toss a coin 10 times, there is no guarantee that I would get exactly 5 heads. I could get 6 heads, 7 heads, whatever. So in that case, the experimental probability would be different. So experimental probability is what actually happens. So, as I said, of course, these two are not always going to be the same. If they were always the same, there'd be no point learning about experimental probability. So let's say, for example, that I toss a coin 10 times, or I toss 10 coins, okay? And I get 7 heads, right? So then the experimental probability, of getting a heads is 7 over 10. Just how many times it happened divided by how many trials there were. Another way to say that is the experimental probability of an event is the number of successes, the number of times it happened, divided by the number of trials. So if I tossed a coin 10 times, got 7 heads, the experimental probability is 7 over 10, but the theoretical probability of getting a head is still a half. So, as I said, these two are not always equal. Sometimes they are. So, if the theoretical probability, which I'll call TP, if the theoretical probability of something is 0, for example, that means it can't happen. So that means the experimental probability will also be 0. Similarly, if the theoretical probability of an event is 1, that means it's certain to happen. That means the experimental probability will always be 1. Because if it is certain to happen, then it will happen all the time. Otherwise, the theoretical probability would not be 1. Okay? I just want to make a quick note that experimental probability is also called relative frequency. They are the exact same thing. So in my example, when I said that if I toss a coin 10 times and I get 7 heads, the experimental probability of getting a heads is 7 over 10, but so is the relative frequency of getting a heads. They are the exact same thing. Now, because experimental probability is still a probability, it follows all the things that we've been talking about. So the experimental probability always has to be between 0 and 1. Of course, you can't have an experimental probability of -1 or 3.2 or whatever, and we still need to write it as such, so we don't say the experimental probability of, getting heads was 70%. It's 7 over 10. Of course, as usual, if the experimental probability is close to 1, it means that it happened most of the time. And if the experimental probability or relative frequency is close to 0, then that means it didn't happen much at all. Okay? Other than that, this has been the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Have a great day.